Hello and welcome to the White Witch podcast with me, Carly. On today's episode, we are talking all about Kennenus, the horned god. But to kick things off today, our book review is Witch Bottle, written by Tom Fletcher. Well, what a weird relationship I had with this book. I started it initially and I couldn't get into it. I nearly quit reading it until a particular character came into the story and changed everything. From there on in, I was hooked and I finished it in no time. This book felt much like a cross between the programme Stranger Things and a James Herbert book. It's a brilliant, eerie, menacing read where you can't really predict what's going to happen if you tried. I felt somewhat dazed, confused, a bit on edge, much as the main character Daniel is through most of the book, who is surviving on minimal sleep as a result of the hauntings. Set in the UK, in the countryside, giving you those Emmerdale vibes. I don't watch Emmerdale, but you know where I'm going with this. We see Daniel, who has become a milkman due to personal reasons that we can't really understand until towards the end. There's a lot of mystery as to why he has changed his life so much. The village that the author creates within this book is brilliant. There are a lot of characters, and it's so interesting to see how they all piece together. Things started to get good for me in the book when Daniel finally builds up the courage to ask Catherine, the local witch who owns a little baked potato shop in the town, out for a date. Little does he know she's cast a spell the night before he finally asks her out to give him the little nudge that he needed. So as their relationship develops, we start to see Daniel delivering witch bottles alongside the milk to the villagers, who seem to be ordering it in their droves from Catherine's website. However, no one knows who the witch is that is making these or realise that she is a local girl. Our story gets more and more sinister with strange events in the village. It builds and it builds. Expect plenty of descriptive gore, a few ghosties, and some dark themes in the book. This book is described as a deeply atmospheric, modern Gothic tale of grief and guilt, and the blurb reads as follows. Something is stirring. The easy monotony of Daniel's job demands nothing from him other than dealing with unreasonable customer demands and the vagaries of his enigmatic boss. But things are changing. Daniel started having nightmares, seeing things that can't possibly be there, like the emaciated giant, which is so real he swears he could touch it if he dared, or the ghost of a man with a black bag over his head. It's not just that night bad things are happening either, or just to him. People are uneasy, seeking unlikely solutions like witch bottles, protective wards to keep harm at bay. But not everyone's happy to find the locals meddling with witch bottles. Things are about to get very unpleasant. I will say one of my lovely ladies, Ashley, in our Patreon, read this book and she didn't enjoy it much. For me, on Goodreads, I gave this book a 4 out of 5. It definitely left its mark on me as I kept thinking on the ending for days afterwards. It's not a particularly happy ending, but in the run-up to Beltane in the Northern Hemisphere and Samhain in the Southern, this might be the perfect blend of supernatural and witchcraft for this time of year. Again, in a fitting nature to tie in with Beltane and Samhain, join me after the break when we discuss Kennenus, who has association with both. Welcome back. So, as I've said before, I usually come to a podcast episode because something has recently inspired me. This week, it was following me posting a funny meme in the Patreon Discord that said, I don't always dance with Satan, but when I do so deliciously. And alongside, I wrote, this is what I need to say the next time I get asked by a muggle if witchcraft is linked to or about worshipping Satan, which is something I have been asked in a few interviews and in general, as I'm sure that you may have too. In the picture is a funny illustration of a little girl playing the flute and a little boy prancing around merrily with a black horned goat. And this got us on to discussing how Satan is often linked to the craft due to the horned god. Of course, this opens up a whole new rabbit hole that I needed to go down, but that also ties in wonderfully with Beltane, which is soon upon us here, and Samhain if you are the other side of the world, two sabbaths that he is linked to. I'm going to take you through where the horned god is said to have originated from and how he has been perceived over the course of time. So, the word Thea appears in both modern Scottish and Irish Gaelic dictionaries as having two meanings of deer and god. In several tales, the deer is seen as some form of god or a divine messenger. In fairy lore, deer are their cattle, and a red deer is often the common form a fairy woman would take upon shapeshifting, whereas witches are seen transforming into mice, hares, cats, or black sheep, but never into the sacred deer. So this section from the deer cult and the deer goddess cult of the ancient, written by Mackay, explains things a little bit further. Long, long ago, a state of society existed in the Highlands when woman was supreme. All women were supernatural and magical. We still are. All ghosts, whether of male or female creatures, were feminine. Fairyland of the other world was tenanted or inhabited by exclusively women. Men were in the hunting stage of development and feared women, their spiritual mothers, all of whom were capable of guiding the destinies of men magically, either for their weal or woe as they chose. The deer was a god, the ghosts of deer became fairy or supernatural women, and deer were the cattle of the fairies or of supernatural beings. Priests or priestesses in many pagan animal cults would often wear ornamental headdresses of the sacred deer. Scottish folk tales of a deer woman that Mackay theorises could be explained by this practice. So these folk tales are of a hunter who has been stalking deer. He observes on taking up his gun to take aim that the animal has suddenly changed into a woman. So in this tale, he falls in love with her, an adventure ensues. They become separated until he later finds her on a distant island, following which they wed and live happily ever after. Deer cults and deer goddess cults date from a remote matriarchal time. Diana, Artemis, and her nymphs are a good example that hints at this older heritage. So again, another section from the deer cult and the deer goddess cult of the ancient by Mackay reads as follows. In ancient Gaul, people would sacrifice animals to Artemis for permission to hunt. This practice could be based on an Aboriginal Gaulish deer goddess cult, from which the horned god Kennenus was a patriarchal interpretation of the deer goddess. This ancient Gaulish god is always represented in a squatting posture. He is gigantic and wears sometimes antlers and sometimes bull's horns. Professor Sir John Rees thought that the name Kennenus and the Latinized form of it, Kennenus, contain the common stem kern, cognate with the Welsh and Irish corn, or Latin cornu, English horn. Bear with me. Again, it always gets really confusing. The name suits the god admirably. More the horns show what the animal was, with which he was connected or which was sacred to him, that is, the deer. In this matter, he must be compared with the Highland deer goddesses. So, the Gauls were a group of Celtic peoples of continental Europe in the Iron Age and the Roman period. The region inhabited by the ancient Gauls, comprising modern-day France and parts of Belgium, Western Germany and northern Italy. A Celtic race, the Gauls lived in an agricultural society divided into several tribes ruled by a landed class. This is where it gets like a history lesson, so bear with me. But yeah, just going to give you some insight into the different origins also with Kennenus. So in the town of Saints in Charente Maritime region of France, there is a carved figure supposed to be Kennenus with a female figure sitting next to him holding a cornucopia resting on her left arm, implying that she is the figure of a generous goddess. Kennenus was the great figure according to Gaulish ideas, and his associate was apparently of smaller consequence in their sight. It's believed that the Celtic society created a masculine horned god from the deer goddess. By her appearing beside him in this statue, she is almost his shadow, and this was at a time where the deer goddess matriarchy would have very few worshippers, whilst worshippers of the male Kennenus were numerous. Again, coming back to the deer cult and the deer goddess cult of the ancient by Mackay, he writes, the evidence from the Highlands and Ireland suggests in the strongest manner that the antlers, the gigantic stature, the squatting posture, and the chthonic or plutonic character of Cernunnos had been stolen or borrowed, or inherited either from his associate goddess or from some other female divinity or group of female divinities, the Highland and Irish deer goddesses. He is, in short, merely a masculine transformation of a feminine divinity, merely a reflection of the change from matriarchy to patriarchy, and his subordinate associate is merely a survival of the former state of society. Find that so interesting how it all originated from a goddess. Whispers of the deer goddess remain in traditional English and German stag dances that are performed by men who dress in women's clothes. This preserves a memory of a time when stag dances were performed by women and of a late time when religious functions of women were usurped by men. So this is a section from Starhawk. The horned god is difficult to understand because he does not fit into any of the expected stereotypes, neither those of the macho male nor the reverse images of those who deliberately seek effeminacy. He is gentle, tender, and comforting, but he is also the hunter. He is the dying god, but his death is always in service of the life force. He is untamed sexuality, but sexuality as a deep, holy, connecting power. He is the power of feeling and the image of what men could be if they were liberated from the constraints of patriarchal culture. The horned god embodies the power of feeling. His animal horns represent the truth of undisguised emotion, which seeks to please no masters. He is untamed, but untamed feelings are very different from enacted violence. The horned god is the life force, the life cycle. He remains within the orbit of the goddess. His power is always directed towards the service of life. You'll be relieved to know that's the heavy part of this episode over, but that gives you insight into Kennenus' ancient origins. Kennenus is an ancient Celtic god known as the Horned One, the Horned God, Master of the Hunt and Lord of Wild Things. His energy is wild and yet welcoming. He is said to call to those who need to reconnect to their primal instincts and to the earth. A mysterious figure, often surrounded by animals, he ruled over the wilderness and brought natural enemies together in peace. Kennenus was a mediator of man and nature, able to tame predator and prey so they might lie down together. Worshipped by the ancient Celts and possibly also by Indo-Europeans who lived in Europe prior to the Celts. Kennenus worship was widespread through Europe, with the most evidence of his cult in Britain, France, and Spain. At least 50 archaeological artifacts with his image have been discovered, mostly in northern France. Kennenus is depicted as a man with antlers or horns, and he is believed to be an ancient god of fertility, beasts, and the wild. The most famous depiction of Kennenus is on the Gundestrup cauldron, dating from the 1st century BC. On the cauldron, Kennenus is a man with antlers, sitting cross-legged, flanked by wild animals. He holds a torque in one hand and a snake in the other. He also wears a torque around his neck. A torque is a Celtic piece of jewellery, typically worn around the neck or chest that's made of thick metal. Kennenus appears to wear or hold a torque in nearly every depiction of him. In some depictions, he merely holds one, while in others he wears them either on his neck or antlers. So you might want to acquire your own torque and dedicate it to Kennenus. So another famous depiction of Kennenus is a statue called the Pillar of the Boatman, discovered in the foundation of Notre Dame Church, and this piece dates back to 14 BC. Little is known of Kennenus, for almost nothing was written about him. He was a god of wild places, often appeared as a bearded man with antlers. Some scholars believed his name and characteristics originally belonged to a number of horned gods that were then mixed together. Others have suggested Kennenus' traits were taken from Greco-Roman deities of similar appearance. In any case, it is best to remember that these gods were not necessarily the same entity, but instead emerged from similar cultural origins. Kennenus was a particularly mysterious deity. His name appeared only once in historical sources, and none of his tales have survived from antiquity. Modern scholars and neo-pagans have nevertheless attributed a number of tales to the horned god. Kennenus was a god of the wild who ruled over pristine nature and uncivilized ways. Animals were his subjects, and 3 growing fruits and vegetables his bounty. Some scholars have connected Kennenus to oak trees, which served as prominent symbols in Celtic lore and Druidry. Classical depictions of the deity included gatherings of animals such as elk, wolves, snakes, and aurochs. Such gatherings were possible thanks to Kennenus' ability to bring natural enemies into peaceful communion with one another. And this ability may have cast Kennenus as a protector and provider amongst rural tribes and hunters. Horned gods were a popular image in world mythology, as many shamanic cultures used sympathetic magic to appear as the animal whose attributes they wished to take. When shamans wished to take on the attributes of a deer and elk, they would wear the animal's fur and antlers. Kennenus began a particularly active second life in the 19th century when spiritual movements seeking to revive pre-Christian European beliefs grew in popularity. The deity appeared prominently in Margaret Murray's The God of the Witches as the embodiment of horned deities. The text stated that Kennenus was the god of witches during pre-Christian times, and that his worship continued in secret pockets throughout Europe following the spread of Christianity. Despite the book's problematic nature and many generalizations, particularly in regards to Kennenus, it did bring the horned god back into the public eye. Kennenus, the horned god of neo-pagan traditions, is lord of both life and death. He grows old as the year progresses before being reborn and starting the cycle anew. He exists in tandem with the divine feminine, the goddess, who is at once both mother and lover. In many traditions, his power stems from her. Note that Kennenus' neo-pagan attributes do not necessarily reflect his pre-Christian characteristics. It's said that Gerald Gardner put Kennenus forward to be considered as the horned god of Wicca. Some scholars have connected Kennenus to the legend of Herne the Hunter, a character that first appeared in Shakespeare's The Merry Wives of Windsor. After committing a great offence, Herne killed himself to avoid dishonouring himself. He then proceeded to haunt the forest, terrorising animals that crossed his path. Since the 19th century, scholars have attempted to find verifiable evidence that this story predated Shakespeare. While no irrefutable evidence has been found, some claim it nevertheless exists in the form of a Celtic or Anglo-Saxon legend that originated in Windsor. Kennenus' closest analogues in world mythology were Pan and Silvanus from the Greco-Roman world. So Pan and Silvanus were horned gods, most commonly depicted to goat-like features, who ruled the wild places of the world. The Greeks and Romans would have closely associated the two. Kennenus was also closely connected to the Germanic Wotan, a variant of the Norse god Odin. Wotan was the leader of the wild hunt, a horned god who led spirits on hunts for powerful warriors and the spirits of the dead. Wotan was also closely related to animals and in some cases even served as their lord. It is unclear if these similarities to Kennenus are intentional or simply mere coincidence. Some scholars believe that, along with Pan, Kennenus may have inspired the enemies of the Knights Templar to create Baphomet, a false deity, demon they were accused of worshipping. Baphomet displayed physical similarities to both deities, and his name was a corruption of a Latinized form of Muhammad. Baphomet has since become a prominent figure in modern witchcraft and satanic religion. So, names you might wish to refer to him as if you work with him are the Horned God, Lord of the Wild Things, God of the Hunt, God of Wild Places, and the Horned One. His domain is over the forest, animals, fertility, nature, traveling, the hunt, abundance, sexuality, healing, virility, survival, to connect with the divine masculine and your hidden primal instincts. Working with Kennenus is said to be difficult because he is an ancient, wild, and primal deity. He is a god who honors his instincts and wildlife above all else. But I read that if you do work with him, he is very much like a protective friend. You might want to set altar space for him using the colours green and brown to represent the colours of the forest and earth. You might want to use statues or pictures of him upon your altar. Candles, acorns, tree leaves, part of a tree branch. So you might want to add to your altar a cauldron or a torque, offering bowls and bottles, green and brown stones, perhaps deer figures, statues, or pictures. You might leave regular offerings as an energetic exchange for support with your magical workings or simply to show gratitude. Kennenus is said to like wine, water, mead, ale, homemade bread, tree branches, acorns, flowers, and seed pods. It's said that connecting with Kennenus is probably best done within the woods. So you might want to take a walk in the woods or wilderness, or go camping or hiking to connect with his presence. He is said to speak through the trees and animals. So take the time to look, listen, and feel. You might want to consider carrying out your rituals or spell work within the woods to invoke his presence and amplify your magic strength. So I referenced the talk earlier, a piece of Celtic jewellery that's made of thick metal and usually worn around the neck or chest. And again, in almost every depiction of Kennenus, he is seen wearing a talk or holding one. You might want to purchase and dedicate one to him. You could ask him to charge it with his energy through leaving it on your altar. You might want to wear it during rituals or use it to increase your primal instincts, perhaps for protection. You may wish to place a cauldron on your altar in homage to the depiction of Kennenus on the Gundestrup cauldron, but maybe use it for your spell work and rituals, or more poignantly as a way to make offerings to the horned god. I've been adding charcoal discs and herbs to mine of late, so you might want to burn herbs that are associated with Kennenus in his honour. Because the horned god is a protector of wildlife, you might wish to honour him by helping wildlife. So perhaps wildlife charities or groups, or simply independently through assisting wild animals in nature wherever you can. So many who work with Kennenus in their craft use shamanic drumming and maybe trance work to reach an otherworldly state of mind and reconnect with their primal self. It's here in this esoteric state we are disconnected from reality and more connected to our bodies, where Kennenus dwells. And I must admit, I've longed to look into more masculine deity energy recently, and I really feel intrigued and keen to look further into Kennenus as a god that I would really like to work with. There's something about the primal side to working with him, the shamanic aspect, that really aligns already with a lot of my craft. So you might want to put on some shamanic drumming or beat the drum yourself, or, you might want to hold a bonfire this Beltane and dance in the wilderness, and perhaps see if you feel the call of the Celtic horned god himself. So an account I found online of someone who works with him, they gave some insight into how their relationship feels to them. He comes to me personally as both compassionate and stern. Our very first interactions revolved around him chastising me for being too willing to follow in the footsteps of others and not defining my own path enough, much like a father would a son. A stern reprimand born out of love, but stinging nonetheless. This is a lesson he drilled into me from the very beginning of our relationship. He is also very clear and matter-of-fact in his answers when I seek him out for divination. It doesn't matter if it's something you want to hear or not. He will tell you what you need to hear. He is an excellent counsellor if you can take the heat. He is not one to pull punches. He is intricately connected to the land and the land spirits. To work with him is to accept the fact that he will be inviting spirits of all sorts into your life, and you will have to learn how to listen and communicate with them as well. He embodies all aspects of nature, both light and dark. This includes humans. Kennenus, who interacts with me in a very human and compassionate manner, fully aware of the complexities of modern life. When I invoke him in the wild, it is entirely different. His arrival is heralded by a sense of pure, want to tear your skin off, painful eroticism. Kennenus is both life and death, and this is very basis of life itself. In this form, he is the rutting stag, life force, pure and vital. For this reason, I personally consider him to be a god of ecstasy. And although we can never know for certain, I'd be willing to bet there was an ecstatic component to his historical rites. He is also a god of the underworld, and as such connected with death as well. Nature is both harsh and blind. The lessons of the Horned One are not easy. While he is compassionate, he is also equally as cruel as nature itself, and it will be wise not to forget it. This is not a god who will be sanitized for our easy consumption. He is many things, loving, yes, but also dark and unforgiving. So, a summary of Kennenus. He appears as a man with either deer antlers or ram horns, often sitting cross-legged in a meditation position. He wears the Celtic torque on his chest or holds it in his hand. He is sometimes portrayed with 3 faces or 3 heads, demonstrating his connection with the life, death, rebirth cycle, similar to the triple goddess. His sacred animals are said to be the stag, the ram-horned snake, the bull, dog, rat, boar, wolf, goat, bear, and horse. His elements are earth and air. Planet is Mercury. Day is Sunday and Wednesday. Colours are green, brown, gold, silver. Crystals and stones sacred to him are said to be peridot, amber, jet, clear quartz, tiger's eye. Symbols, the cauldron and the torque. Feast days are Beltane, Samhain and Yule. Herbs and trees that are sacred to him are said to be oak, pine, juniper, cedar, ash, rosemary, almond, sandalwood, musk, ivy, mistletoe, valerian, holly, and sunflower. Symbols are acorns, oak leaves, mistletoe, fruits, the sun, grain, horns, torques, animal pelts, pine cones, fire, sunflower seeds, holly leaves, and berries. Sacred place to him are, of course, forests and fields, but overall, all wild, unspoiled places. So again, offerings, you can make him wine, water, milk, antler sheds, leaves, soil, his sacred plants, acts of sexuality, primal drumming music, entering an otherworldly state. His spiritual allies or aliases are the Green Man, Pan, Puck, and Herne the Hunter. And influences are fertility, life and death, animals, wealth, strength and courage, hunting, the underworld, and protection. And to finish things up, I have prayer to the Horned God. Horned One of the wilderness, winged one of the shining skies, rayed one of the spendrous sun, fallen one of the Samhain cries, I call amidst the standing stones, praying that you, O Ancient One, will deign to bless my mystic rites, O fiery Lord of the blazing sun. So that's all I have for you today, all about Cernunnos. I hope that has resounded with you. I would love to hear from you if you already work with him, or if following this episode that you feel the call to. I'll be back soon with another podcast episode. Before I go, I would love it if you could give a little bit of love to a project that me and my very good friend Rachael the Hedge Witch have been working on. You may or may not know, we also host a podcast called The Hedge Witch's Almanac. There will be a Beltane episode out for that shortly. But we have created our own small book press print, and our first book that's coming out is called The Hedge Witch's Garden. This is a book packed full of illustrations. There's kitchen witchery, there's all about deities in there, all about sabbaths, And I would love it if you could take a look at this. The details will be in the show notes, and also how you can order through Etsy. This is a bit of a deep dive into different hedge witch practices and everything hedge witchy, basically. So, working with plants, there's like shamanic practices. But yes, there'll be some details in the show notes. So I would love it if you could take a look and, perhaps buy a copy. You can also find details in the show notes of my Patreon. I am always over on Patreon. I love it. It is my main piece of work now. So come on over if you want to just have a little look. But in a nutshell, each month you will receive a meditation linked to our monthly theme. Our monthly theme this month is the Green Witch. There is our witchy Patreon over on Discord. So there is always a conversation going on over there. There are so many wonderful witches. It has grown so much. We have our Beltane Coven chats coming up soon. Again, I'll put all the details in the show notes. Also, within the membership, you get a story or piece of folklore each month. There's a Patreon podcast episode. So yeah, Patreon podcast episode, a meditation, a story, hedge witch studies where we look at 3 plants each month. We also have the Literary Witches Coven, where whoever wants to get involved, not everybody does, but a good majority of the coven, we read a book together, we choose which book together that we're going to read, and we have a little meeting to discuss our thoughts on that, but also all things witchy. So check that out in the show notes if you'd love to join a lovely coven. And, these wonderful witches are all over the world. So it is so amazing to see how we all celebrate different sabbaths, what we're all doing in our craft, what plants and herbs are native to where we live. Oh my goodness, you are all over the world. And I want to just say a massive shout out to all my Patreons, because you witches literally keep me going with doing this as my job. Like, I cannot thank you enough. I'm so grateful. You keep me going. So anyway, that's enough of me waffling on. Have a wonderful week, witches. I will catch up with you all soon. Lots and lots of witchy love.